the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Golden Age of Cricket podcast. My name is Tom Ford. Few cricketing figures prior to World War I hold our attention quite like Victor Trumper. His batting feats, constant humility, and devastatingly early death combined to keep him on the pedestal as the beau ideal, as one writer phrased it. A new book has been published which chronicles the final tour undertaken by Trumper to New Zealand in 1914 with a group of fellow Australians, which included the great batsman's final first-class match. One of the co-authors of that publication joins me today to discuss the tour and Trumper's involvement. Ric Sissons is the author of 11 other cricket books, including The Players, which won the English Cricket Society's Silver Jubilee Literary Award, and Billy Murdoch with Richard Cashman, which won the Australian Cricket Society Literary Award. His previous book, When the Kangaroo Met the Eagle, the 1913 Australian tour of Canada and the United States, with Peter Schofield, won the 2024 Australian Cricket Society Literary Award. His latest book, Trumper Across the Tasman, the 1914 Australian tour of New Zealand, is also co-authored with Peter Schofield, and Rick returns to the podcast today. Hello, Rick.
Hey, Tom. Nice to be here.
Thanks for joining. Rick, a lot of my listeners might be familiar with your writing, but recently I've noted that you've made your focus these pictorially splendid accounts of cricket tours, such as your book from a few years ago on the MCCs tour to Australia in 1903-04, and the Australians tour of America and Canada in 1913, which I just mentioned in the introduction. What is it about these tours that grabs your interest?
Well, I'm particularly interested in that period. Other books I've written, on Duff or Turner, all relate to that pre-1914 period. The tours themselves I found quite interesting because let's start with the 1903-04 MCC tour, which set an important precedent in that this was the first tour organised by MCC. They took control of it, whereas previously the tours to Australia had been organised by players, Shaw and Shrewsbury, for example, or had been teams invited by Melbourne Cricket Club. In 03-04, Lords and the MCC took control and paid the players a fixed fee. And there was some argy-bargy negotiations about this between various players, notably Braun and Johnny Tildesley. Now, that set a precedent for the Australian Cricket Board, which had been recently formed, to try and take control of Australian tours to England, which up until that point had been run and controlled, managed, and the profits shared by the players themselves. And they progressively the Australian board began to take control until in 1912 you had the famous Big Six dispute where Trumper and 5 other players refused to tour because the Australian board said you can have any manager you want for the tour, but it cannot be Frank Laver for some reason. So then what you have after that are these 2 separate tours organised 1913 to North America by an entrepreneur in the US, Benjamin, who had helped the 1912 Australians back through North America. And again, that was not under the control of the Australian Cricket Board, but was organised by the players. And then in this tour to New Zealand was exactly the same in 1914. Arthur Sims, who was a good first-class player in New Zealand, but was a successful businessman. He made an offer to the New Zealand Cricket Council that he would pay for and organise a tour of Australians to New Zealand. So that's the overarching theme of all of these tours is confrontation with the boards, I guess, and also controlled by the players.
So your current release, or the book that's just been published, Trumper Across the Tasman, which focuses on the 1914 Australian tour of New Zealand, it was co-authored with another Sydney-sider gentleman called Peter Schofield, as was your previous book, The Tour of America and Canada. Can you explain your relationship with Peter and how the collaboration works in the sense of putting a book together?
Well, Peter's, as you may know, is one of Australia's most notable cricket collectors. Got a huge
Yes.
collection of memorabilia, but all pre-1914, and particularly Victor Trumper material. He's
Mm.
authored some books of his own on Trumper and that period, and on ones on postcards and other cigarette cards, memorabilia from that period. So, in his own right, he's a well-established author, um, but he's also very generous with his time and time and materials, and happy to let people use the materials in his collection. That's how I first came across him. Um, so basically, the division on these books is I predominantly do the research and writing, and
Mm-hmm.
Peter does a lot of the work on the imagery. And then we've also, on these last two books, been working with a really good book designer. We really want these books to be beautiful pieces of work, to be honest. And these two books, I think, they're lovely, large
Mm.
format hardbacks with very large imagery, which really, speak to the period.
Yeah, and I'm assuming, Rick, that I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Peter might produce a postcard or an image that you hadn't seen before, which then might fuel further research. Is it a collaboration in that sense?
Yes, well, so on both of the books, we were fortunate in finding other collections. Say from on the North America book, there were some beautiful glass plates from one of the libraries in Philadelphia, which hadn't really been used
Mm.
before, and they reproduced fantastically well. On the 1914 book, of course, we had access to Frank Laver's collection, which is at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, which again is
Mm-hmm.
a tremendous resource that was donated to the Melbourne Library, Melbourne Cricket Ground Library. And also, because Laver was on the 1914 tour, he often gave photographs to the players, who produced
Mm.
small books and booklets that they gave to other people. So finding images in those collections then in turn led to us down, more detail and information about particular aspects of the tour.
So, what did you already know about this 1914 tour of the Australians to New Zealand? It happens right before the outbreak of the First World War. I mean, it is known. I mean, after he died, it just became known as the last tour that Trumper undertook. But what did you unearth in your research in preparation for this book?
Well, I mean, we knew about the famous eighth wicket stand. I hadn't realised. I mean, I hadn't really paid, I suppose, I must say, that greater attention. I didn't realise that this was actually on that tour. Trump had played his last first class match.
Mm.
Um, because when he came back after that tour, he didn't play first class cricket again. He played about 6 club matches before he became very ill. He played 4 for Gordon and 2 for some scratch side.
Mm.
I hadn't realised, therefore, his last first class match was in New Zealand, which is obviously quite significant. And I hadn't also realised, until I did the research on it, that the tremendous influence of overseas coaches in New Zealand, much more so than in Australia at the time. I mean, Australia originally had the influence of coaches like Charles Lawrence from the 1870s and 80s, and actually through to the 1890s. He continued to coach as an old man in Melbourne. But in the 1900s, it wasn't the same. In New Zealand, every major association there seemed to have an imported coach. And notably, say, Bert Relf, who played for Sussex in England, was coaching
Yes.
there. Jack Board, who from Gloucestershire, the wicketkeeper from Gloucestershire, he was coaching. And even Saunders, who played for Victoria and Australia, got a job coaching. He got a job as coaching and as groundsman at Wellington, although in the end he really was only working as a groundsman. Apparently, after the first year, nobody particularly thought much of his coaching. And
Hmm.
poor old Saunders didn't get any clients. But that was quite striking, the influence of overseas coaches. And Dan Rees, who will come on, no doubt, to
Yes.
talk about, who was the captain of New Zealand, He wrote about that the tremendously important influence of overseas coaches on the game in New Zealand. So that was all something that I hadn't really been aware of until we began to put this book together.
Yeah, and I will be the first to put my hand up and say I knew very little about this tour. I knew the famous partnership, as you mentioned, and we'll get to later. But it is a very illuminating study, I have to say. Not only beautifully produced, but there are a lot of little pockets that are there to be discovered, and very well put together. So, Rick, before we dive further into the actual tour, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of a lay of the land of New Zealand cricket in and around 1914. They weren't a test-playing nation at this stage, but what was the quality of their players and of their first-class matches?
I suppose one interesting way you could look at that point was in 19 in the Australian season 1913-1914, there was actually a tour to Australia by a New Zealand team, which was pretty much it was captained by Dan Rees and included most of the players who then appeared in the series against the Australians in 1914 in New Zealand. One omission, which was quite controversial, was they didn't include Clary Grimit, who was just making a name for himself in Wellington, and they preferred a couple of older spin bowlers. But it was, from New Zealand's perspective, quite a strong side. They beat Queensland, and as you probably are aware, Queensland at the time wasn't in the Sheffield Shield, and Queensland and Tasmania, when New South Wales and Victoria played Queensland and Tasmania, they basically sent their second 11s. But
Yes.
this New Zealand side beat Queensland, but then they played New South Wales and Victoria, and they lost very heavily in 2 days by an innings to both of them. And against New South Wales, Trumper scored a big century. I think it was a double hundred. So that's sort of indicative that the last game of the tour, they did draw with South Australia and Dan Rees scored a century. But I suppose that's one way of measuring, the New Zealand side wasn't of a standard of the strong Australian state sides, let's put it that way. Cricket within New Zealand seemed to be very rivalrous and competitive between Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch were the three big centres. And that rivalry really was problematic throughout the period we're looking at of, the 1900s in New Zealand. They, of course, did have the Plunket Shield by then. That had been set up in the 1900s.
Yes.
And that seemed to be basically, was from that period, from about 1907 to 1914, was basically won by either Christchurch or Auckland. But they didn't play a genuine round-robin competition where every first-class association played the other associations, home and away until the 1920s. So it was a very strange competition. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that cricket was reorganised in Christchurch in the same way as the Sydney grade competition was organised along the lines of electoral districts. Now, remember, in Sydney, that had happened in the 1890s. So this was, I think, 1905, 06, and cricket in Christchurch began to be organised in a much more competitive way, organised around electoral districts. So I suppose, where are they at? They're, some way behind Australian cricket, there's no doubt, but they're improving all the time. And various tours that happened, people did speak when they came back to about the game was improving in New Zealand. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and improving often off the back of these Australian tours. So we're talking about the 1914 tour today, but it certainly wasn't the first tour that Australians had led to New Zealand. Your book, case in point, actually begins with a recap of the 1905 Australian cricket team who first toured New Zealand on their way to England for the 1905 Ashes. Just as a bit of a understanding for our listeners today, how did that tour unfold? How did the Australian team fare in New Zealand? And how did it also compare with the MCCs tour? Because we can't forget that England players often came to New Zealand. How did the 1905 Australian tour compare with the MCCs tour of New Zealand in 1906-07?
The 1905 Australians went to New Zealand before they went en route to England. So often there'd be tours to New Zealand could be either tacked on at either end of tours, which really wasn't very satisfactory for New Zealand. The 1914 tour is notable because it was the first really genuine tour of New Zealand, which covered both North and South Islands and every major city. So it was quite
Right.
unique in that sense. The 1905 tour, obviously with the Australian side, it's interesting because it's all again about Trumper.
Yes.
It's interesting. You see articles in the paper and comments and pictures with it. He's just considered the world's greatest batsman. Time and time again, you see newspaper references to that. Interestingly, the captain of New Zealand, when that side was there, was Arthur Sims. The point about that is that Sims, who in 1914 wants to organise the tour of New Zealand, is already on good terms with the likes of Noble, Armstrong, Laver and Trumper, because they were all in New Zealand in 1905 when he was the captain of the New Zealand side. So that network begins to form a bit around that time. The MCC tour in 1906-07, I wouldn't say it's a joke, but they just sent a bunch of amateurs who were predominantly Oxford and Cambridge graduates. And it was really, they had a great time. I wouldn't say the cricket was great. I can't, but all the reports out of it in the book that was written about the tour by one of them, members of the tour, just speak about them having a wonderful social time. And I think they cost the New Zealand Cricket Council quite a lot of money unexpectedly in the amateurs' expenses, in inverted commas.
Right.
So that, in a sense, sums up, sadly, the MCC's attitude to developing the game. And you see the same in North America. The MCC never organised a proper tour to help promote the game in North America. And likewise in New Zealand. So, you begin to, how serious were they? Or did they ever consider how important it could be to develop the game not around the world, really, around, the red parts of the empire, as someone once said in 1914,
It is also, we're still in that period where some of these private tours are still being organised, trying to be organised, and we can't think of this period like we do through modern eyes, where everything is official and it's the England cricket team, the best players going to a part of the world. It happens in the 1890s with so-called English cricket team going to South Africa, but it's like you say, it's a second 11, and a bit like what you mentioned before with New South Wales going up to Queensland. It's New South Wales, but it's really a second 11 side. So it's just par for the course during this pre-World
that
War
side, the
I era.
MCC sent to New Zealand in 06-07 wouldn't even be the second. It would be the 50th 11. It was really such a poor side, it was clearly them having a bunch of amateurs having an enjoyable time in New Zealand,
Yeah. Well, it sounds great. I wouldn't knock back a trip to New Zealand either, to be honest.
Sure.
Rick, one of the notable attributes of your tour books are these spotted miniature biographies, which appear throughout, particularly of lesser known cricketers or even cricket administrators, just to help colour the picture of the tour that we're dealing with. One of the first which appears in this 1914 tour book is of Dan Rees, who you've already mentioned and is often regarded as the father of New Zealand cricket. Can you tell us a bit more about Dan and his place in the cricketing landscape?
Yeah, he's a really interesting person who was schoolboy at the same time as Sims, went to the same school. Very early on, shortly after they left school, they both went on a tour for the Canterbury Association of the North Island in
Mm.
1897, 98. So here again, you begin to see this network. Um, and Rees was a very good left arm bowler. He scored a century in 1903 against Lord Hawke's 11,
Hmm.
captained by Warner. Um, but he could never afford to play as an amateur anywhere. He was from a family there wasn't any position to do that, and he went to technical college, got qualifications as an engineer, and then became a marine engineer and travelled to England. He'd also been in Melbourne working for an engineering company where he met Warwick Armstrong, and he played for the Melbourne Cricket Club. He went to England to continue his working career. When he had time, he played with Grace's London County, by which time they were playing basically club matches.
Mm.
And he also did play a few games for Essex in 1906. So he was already a highly thought of and capable cricketer for sure, but he'd also got experience overseas, and he was a successful. He came back and joined his brother Tom and set up a very successful business in and around Christchurch. But he's a person who So look, when they're talking about the business, they used to go on their bike and ride around all the plumbing shops to sell stuff. He was
Mm.
very down to earth sort of person, and he then became captain of the New Zealand side in 1914 when the Australians came, and after that tour, basically retired. But his role in New Zealand cricket was hugely influential beyond that,
Mm.
as a selector, administrator, and part of the what did the MCC called? The Imperial Cricket Conference, was that what it was
Yes.
called? The ICC. So very significant figure, but again, part of this sort of network of Australian and New Zealand cricketers and particularly, the Sims Noble connections, which made it possible to put together this unofficial inverted commas tour in 1914.
Yeah. Now, we've already mentioned some of the previous Australian tours to New Zealand, notably the 1905 one, which was just tapped on, as you say, en route to England. But there were a few other smaller tours arranged to New Zealand, which is again covered in your book. Two of those I'll mention now. So in 1910, there was a tour led by Warwick Armstrong, and we know Warwick, who's is routinely mentioned on this podcast, would just play any match available. He just loved being on the cricket field. And then there was another small tour to New Zealand arranged in 1913. And this surprised me actually, was captained by Harry Trott. Harry's been the recent subject on this podcast. And I say that with surprise because at this point in his life, he's not playing much cricket. He's had a spell in an asylum, and he's not playing Test cricket anymore. So, quite surprised to see that Harry led a tour to New Zealand. What can you tell us about these two tours, the 1910 tour and the 1913 one?
Well, the 1913 one, led by Harry Trott, I think he must be in his mid to late 40s by this
Mm,
point, was the South Melbourne Cricket Club tour. So they were basically playing club matches
right.
there. At the same time, there's also another rather strange tour, which I was not aware of in any way before I started working on this book. The New South Wales teachers used to tour the New South Wales teachers cricket team regularly toured New Zealand in the summer holidays.
Right.
And they would
Mm,
alternate between touring South Island and the North Island. And this was a
mm.
tour organised by a man called Frank McMullen, who was a notable delegate on the New South Wales Cricket Association and a great friend and ally of Victor Trumper.
Mm. Sorry, Rick, were they playing other
Yep.
teachers against New Zealand teachers?
No, I think they were. Yes, they were. They did play other teachers, but they also just played club matches. So
Mm,
there was this. There were tours going backwards and forwards, as you say, and there was the 1910 side, which is a very strong side, captained by Warwick Armstrong, including Hopkins Bardsley, Sid Emery,
mm,
Bill Whitty, Charlie Kellaway. So that was a very strong side. They played against Canterbury. I can't remember the result, but I do remember that Dan Rees scored 108 against them. Armstrong's view when he came back was, having been there in '05 and then in 1910, that he thought New Zealand cricket was improving quite considerably.
right.
The other comment, all these people, when they came back, they were always interviewed by the press, so there's, bits and pieces, but
Yes.
they all thought the wickets were too slow, and that was a recurring theme throughout this period. It was also a comment made by Monty Noble that the wickets were too slow, and they needed to improve the wickets. There needed to be faster wickets if the game was to make progress, well, at first class level in New Zealand. The 1910 tour, though, came very close to being cancelled, which was quite interesting because, in fact, the New Zealand Cricket Council did at one point send a telegram to the Australian board to cancel it, but 2 weeks later, after being berated by the Australian Cricket Board, recanted, and the tour went ahead, and was only just happened only a few days before the players were due to leave.
Right.
But it was all about the different rivalries between the different associations in New Zealand and how this was to be paid for, and Wellington disagreeing with Canterbury and so on and so forth. So that rivalry, again, is a theme that recurs over and over again within cricket in New Zealand at this point.
Interesting. Yeah. Now we.
Oh, one funny thing, by the
Yes.
way,
Go on.
about Harry Trott when he was there. They played against Clary Grimit,
Mm,
Harry Trott said, and obviously Grimit was still quite young then, only just beginning to emerge in Wellington. But it was interesting that Harry Trott noted that Clary Grimit, who eventually, of course, came to Australia and played Test cricket for Australia.
mm,
The other thing besides the slow pitches Harry Trott mentioned was temperance.
yeah.
Temperance was very strong in New Zealand at this time, and there were a number of cities where um, there was no alcohol at all. Although Harry Trott said they never had any problems finding any. So, I suppose that's
It's just the power of being a top level cricketer, I suppose. You could.
I suppose that's right. Overseas cricket teams can always find their way to the alcohol. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was quite interesting. I wasn't aware that temperance movement was so strong in New Zealand at that time.
Neither did I. And it is interesting. You mentioned Clary Grimit, and most cricket fans, I assume, are aware that he was born in New Zealand. But what comes across in your book, because towards the end, when you're talking about legacy, and you do a little profile on Clary, and it sort of reminded me. I was aware, but I often don't have it at the forefront of my mind. I mean, he's not a cricketer who was born in New Zealand, came to Australia as a youngster and learnt his craft there. I mean, he was all, you could say, an established cricketer in New Zealand before he emigrated to Australia and became one of the all-time great leg spinners. It was a refreshing reminder, I have to say, which was featured in your book.
Yeah, that's true. As I said, there was some consternation why he wasn't chosen to go on the New Zealand tour in 13-14 to Australia. Then he did play for Wellington, and he did play for New Zealand at least once against the Australians. In Wellington, he played with Jack Saunders, the
Mm-hmm.
Victorian and Australian bowler from the 1900s. And he, Grimit does credit Saunders with, coaching and helping him. But you're right. By the time he came to Australia, he was a well-established first-class cricketer.
Another cricketer, you mentioned coming to Australia, and we've mentioned him already, is Arthur Sims. So how instrumental was he, Rick, in actually getting this 1940 tour to New Zealand off the ground and past the cricket authorities, who often didn't want, were trying to prohibit this, or at least make the tour come under their auspices? How influential was Arthur Sims?
Well, the tour wouldn't have happened without him, and basically it was a fait accompli. The Australian board was presented with a fait accompli.
Mm.
It was organised and going to happen in the end, whether they approved it or not. And subsequently, they did say that was okay. They felt that they blamed the New Zealand Cricket Council that they said kept them in the dark about all this, and they didn't want to penalise the players who'd already committed to go. What had happened in these previous years was the New Zealand Cricket Council had tried on many occasions to get tours organised to New Zealand.
Mm.
They'd approached New South Wales, they'd approached Victoria, they'd even approached Tasmania as well. And they get no all the time. They were just being rejected. And they tried to get the MCC to agree to get matches on when sides came to play in the play for the Ashes in Australia. Again, the MCC said no. So Sims went to the New Zealand Cricket Council and said, basically, I'm prepared to organise this. I'm prepared to pay for it. Let's do it. And you've got to remember, Sims at this point, again, like Reece, is he's built his own business up. He's very, very strong laissez-faire capitalist.
Yes.
And he built a large business up shipping frozen lamb from New Zealand and Australia to Britain, because at that point you'd now got shipping which was capable of carrying frozen meat. So he'd made a lot of money doing this. He'd also given me a lot of connections, and because he was a good cricketer in his own right, he already knew Noble, Laver, Armstrong. He knew Dan Reith very well, obviously, because they'd been playing from schoolboy level together. So he was really capable of doing this. In a way, he's not quite the same, but there's sort of something Packer-esque about him, He was going to do this and run it and take it on. And the Australian board, well, they could, take it or leave it, but it was going to happen. So he had all the connections to put it together, and he did, and signed, got all the players signed up. But you've also got to remember that Noble had retired from international cricket in 2009.
Yes.
Armstrong had been forced out of the captaincy of the Victorian side in a coup d'etat. Trumper had been part of the Big Six. So the ground was there. These players were more than happy. They didn't feel any great allegiance to the Australian Cricket Board. Frank Laver, who Sims really liked, thought was a great manager, had been told that, we're not having you as manager of the 1912 tour to England. You are persona non grata. So, the ground was there for Sims to sow the seeds of this tour, which he did. And, in the end, the Australian board had to agree to it. The Australian board's attitude, the one question they were obsessed by, was they wanted to know from the New Zealand Cricket Council who was paying the players and how much were they being paid.
Right.
And the New Zealand Cricket Council's response was, well, we don't know. You better talk to Arthur Sims. But that issue about it's the whole issue for the Australian board
Payment
about who's paying players, payments, how much, and it's outside of our control.
Yes. And of course, with Frank Laver being on tour as well, and all the rupture that he had caused or been involved with the Big Six, that must have raised some eyebrows as well. But definitely a marketer's dream for New Zealand, with Trumper and Noble effectively coming out of retirement, and Warwick Armstrong, all very big names. It must have been great for New Zealand audiences to know that, or crowds to know that those names were coming to their shores.
Absolutely.
I'd like to find out, as I said before, oh, won't someone please kindly put me at ease? Tell me why?
Rick, one of my favourite things about the Golden Age, the so-called Golden Age, is looking at team photos, because there's nothing uniform about them. I mean, if you look at some of the county photos, you've got amateurs and players in their order, but they're wearing a mixture of boater hats and skull caps and various blazers. And, if you're CB Fry, you're wearing whatever you want to. And the same thing happens in Australia as well, probably not to such a degree, but you include in your book of this 1914 tour one of my all-time favourite photos, and I'm sure you know which one it is. It's the Australian team gathered together. It looks like it's on a riverbank. There's some trees behind, and it is just an absolute mixture of dress and personnel. There's two wives included in the photo, Monty Noble's wife and Warwick Armstrong's wife. And then again, you get them wearing all sorts of things. I think they're wearing their state blazers, or a mixture of some are wearing Australian blazers. But what's interesting as well is that this photo really represents almost the passing of an age. You've got the veterans that we've already mentioned, Noble, Laver, Armstrong and Trumper. But then you've got this new generation coming through. You've got a young Arthur Maley, Jack Crawford, and Bert Collins even is on tour. So let's talk about the actual team that made it to New Zealand. What are your thoughts on the makeup of that squad?
Well, let me say, I agree. I think this is a beautiful photograph. I mean, it's some of these team photographs. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the photographs that used to be taken of the English tourists in Adelaide in the Botanical Gardens. There's some beautiful photographs taken there. And this is the same. It was taken in Christchurch, in a park, probably, as you say, a riverbank there. It's beautiful background. It's a stunning photograph. The interesting point that you make there is that team in 1914 didn't have blazers, caps, or any uniform of. So the 1913 team to North America had, when you see them photographed, they had a cap badge, they had a blazer badge, and they had all the correct gear. This team, because it was only put together for a tour of 2 months, they were just wearing whatever badges and blazers and caps they wanted to take. So you do get that assortment, as you said, which it makes it quite I actually like that about
it's charming.
Yeah, exactly, perfect, charming. Yeah, it is a really charming photograph. Adding the wives in is brilliant too. Bill Ferguson's there as well.
Yes, scorer.
The scorer. And a slightly mysterious fellow called Bill McCall, who's the assistant manager, who couldn't really find much about, but he actually played in one game when they were a player short early on. So everybody who was on the whole group is in the photograph. Everybody, Yeah, the interesting point that there's a generational check. You've got the older Noble and Armstrong, and then Maley, who by that point hadn't played for Australia, but was taking a lot of wickets for Redfern, and had got them forcing his way into New South Wales side. Collins and Cody, Bert Collins and Les Cody had been playing together and played rugby league together, actually, for Eastern Suburbs for a few games. At Oakland, and we're on the fringes of the New South Wales side. Collins obviously becomes much more established than Les Cody. And Jack Crawford, who was a prodigious talent, who'd been played for Surrey as a schoolboy, and then was forced out of the Surrey side and out of the England side as well, for that matter, and emigrated to South Australia, where he was a great presence in the South Australian side, helped them win the Sheffield Shield.
Yes.
So there was a new generation of younger players and the older players, plus, the two wives, the scorer, Bill Ferguson. So, everybody who was on the tour was in this beautiful photograph. The notable absentees, Warren Barsi, I don't know why he wasn't on the tour. He'd gone to North America the previous year. He'd been incredibly successful in 1912 in England, along with Charlie McCartney. McCartney was on the 1913 tour of North America as well. What I did, there was references in the paper. McCartney felt that it might damage his relationship with the Australian board if he went on the tour of New Zealand. And he obviously had some aspirations to be captain, I think, of Australia at some point, and didn't want to have a detrimental relationship with the Australian board.
What's interesting about Bardsley's absence is he's a bit like Armstrong in that he just loves to play cricket. I mean, any opportunity. So it does make it all the more peculiar that he's not on this tour. So, Rick, let's talk about Victor Trumper. And I'm sure many of the listeners today are keen to hear about Trumper's efforts on this tour. It was a surprise to many reading your book, audiences and crowds and administrators, that he actually made the trip to New Zealand, having not toured England in 1912, as you said, or in any of the previous tours to New Zealand of the recent years, such as 1910. So how was Victor Trumper placed in 1914, both from a health perspective, but also a cricketing one?
Undoubtedly, Trumper was a phenomenal player, but compared to 1902 or 1905, he's beginning to wane slightly. I use the word reservedly because he was such a fantastic player. But there was speculation that when he was ill, he actually had tuberculosis. This is Gideon Hayes' view in his book on Trumper, that he probably had TB, and he probably hadn't really recovered from that, and this was lingering. But if you look at the photographs in this period, 1913-14, the New South Wales side pictures, for example, he does not look well.
Yes,
he was late. He pulled out of the 1913 tour of North America at the last minute. That was a longer tour, and also with testimonial just happened. He got things he needed to finish. His businesses hadn't been going well, and his wife was expecting a second child in 1913. That was all to some extent behind him in 1914. And this was a shorter tour. It was only 2 months. He didn't arrive until the fourth match. His wife had been ill. He didn't leave with the other players. His businesses by this point seemed to have been sorted out. According to Ashley Mallett's book, he was actually just working as a tie salesman by January 1914.
Right.
So I suppose things were much more stable from that point of view. But, as we know, this incredible innings he played in 293 was, in a sense, his last great hurrah in terms of his cricketing career, because he was dead
Swan song.
Yeah, exactly, because he was dead the following year. But in New Zealand, this is who they wanted. I mean, it would have been terrible if he had pulled out at that tour. It was who everybody wanted to see. I mean, Arthur Maley, when he got back from the tour, gave an interview to the referee where he said everywhere they went, people wanted to know who's Trumper, where's Trumper, at railway stations, everywhere. And to take the pressure off Trumper, Maley says that everybody on the team at one point or another had to play the part of Trumper. Now, Arthur Maley's stories, one always has to take with a pinch of salt, but
sure,
this wasn't Maley writing his memoirs years and years later. This was Maley a month after the tour, so I think there was probably that was probably true, and that's who the crowds wanted to see. And when he was out, they were disappointed. Similar to the whole Bradman thing. They turned up to see Bradman. When he was out, they left. Similar thing. You get the impression with Trumper as well.
Yeah, and little did they know that, of course, 18 months later he would be dead. All very sad.
Exactly. Yeah, tragic.